For 150 years, Britain's 13 colonies grew into a network of thriving communities, stretching from New Hampshire to Georgia. Over 2 million people built their lives around a massive volume of commerce that buzzed through these Atlantic ports. These colonists functioned with a high degree of autonomy, electing their own local assemblies and managing their own internal affairs. They viewed themselves as fully enfranchised British citizens, entitled to the same rights as those living in London. This era of relative independence shifted in 1763, following the conclusion of the 7 Years' War. This map illustrates the vast territory Britain gained after defeating France, but that expansion came at a tremendous financial cost. The rising bar chart shows the resulting surge in national debt that left the British government searching for new sources of revenue. Parliament determined that the American colonies, as the primary beneficiaries of the war's protection, should provide the funds necessary to pay down these imperial debts. This decision created an immediate friction between an empire demanding absolute financial authority and a colonial population accustomed to a century of self-governance. This document displays repeating rows of 1-penny British revenue stamps, the physical tools used to enforce the Stamp Act. The handwritten signatures at the bottom show the bureaucratic machinery required to collect these taxes, inserting imperial oversight into daily colonial transactions. While the financial cost was significant, the colonists focused on the underlying legal precedent. They argued that Parliament had no constitutional right to tax a populace that lacked any representatives in the British government. This ideological stand coalesced into a single rallying cry that unified the diverse colonies: no taxation without representation. Resistance moved from legal arguments to direct action as merchants organized boycotts and protesters filled the streets to disrupt the tax collection process. By 1770, the frequent confrontations between local protesters and British regulars created a volatile environment in Boston, where the presence of the military served as a constant source of provocation. The friction turned violent when British soldiers fired into a crowd of civilians, killing several protesters in what became known as the Boston Massacre. The deaths of these civilians transformed the resistance, turning a dispute over taxes into a radicalized movement against British military presence in the colonies. Tensions remained high for the next 3 years, coming to a head when Parliament passed the Tea Act. Even though the law lowered the actual price of tea, colonists saw it as an attempt to force their submission to British authority and bypass their local assembly's right to tax. On the night of December 16, 1773, members of the Sons of Liberty boarded British ships in Boston Harbor. Disguised as Native Americans, they began breaking open the cargo to destroy the tea before it could be taxed and sold. They dumped more than 300 chests of tea into the harbor, a massive act of sabotage against the British East India Company. London responded with immediate fury, viewing the destruction of property as a direct challenge to the Crown's sovereignty. Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts, which shuttered Boston Harbor and stripped Massachusetts of its right to self-government. This attempt to isolate Massachusetts failed. When other colonies saw a royal charter erased and a major port closed by decree, they recognized a threat to their own political survival. They began coordinating a unified response to ensure their rights could not be revoked individually. In a show of solidarity, representatives from 12 colonies gathered at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia to debate a collective strategy. They demanded a restoration of their constitutional rights, while simultaneously instructing local militias to begin stockpiling gunpowder and weapons for a potential conflict. Neither side was willing to concede ground. The British government prepared to enforce its laws by force, while the colonies refused to yield their autonomy. The struggle now focused on the ultimate question of political power and the right of the colonies to govern themselves. The political stalemate ended in April 1775, when British troops marched into the countryside, triggering the first shots of the war at Lexington and Concord. The era of diplomatic protest was over. The American Revolution had begun. 13 loosely connected colonies were now at war with the global land and sea forces of the British Empire. To survive, they would need more than local militias. They needed a unified continental army and a commander capable of leading them through the conflict ahead. On a cold December night in Boston Harbor, heavy wooden crates hit the freezing water. This deliberate destruction of property shattered decades of peace. Look at this map of the eastern seaboard. For a century and a half, the 2 million people living across this vast land considered themselves loyal British subjects. Farmers and merchants built thriving communities here, enjoying a rare level of self-government. That autonomy collided with reality in 1763, after Britain defeated France in the 7 Years' War. Securing its empire nearly bankrupted the treasury. To the British government, the solution was obvious. The American colonies needed to help pay the enormous military debt. Parliament passed laws like the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. Looking at this sheet of 1-penny revenue stamps, you see the bureaucratic scale of the new system. Every legal document, newspaper, and pamphlet required a physical stamp, paid in British currency. Parliament enacted these levies without the consent of the colonial assemblies. For the colonists, the danger was the precedent. If London could tax them without a vote, the rights they claimed were no longer inherent. They were privileges held at the mercy of a legislature 3,000 miles away. The response was immediate. A single powerful grievance began circulating through the colonial assemblies and local taverns. No taxation without representation. Resistance mobilized quickly. Merchants coordinated boycotts. Ordinary people gathered in the streets, turning quiet political frustration into highly visible public anger. In 1770, that anger turned fatal. British soldiers occupying Boston fired into a crowd of civilian protesters, killing several people. This clash, known as the Boston Massacre, proved the Crown was willing to use lethal military force to maintain control. 3 years later, Parliament attempted to force another tax via the Tea Act. In response, the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves, boarded merchant ships, and destroyed over 300 chests of tea. The destruction of the tea incensed the British government. They retaliated with a series of severe punishments, known as the Intolerable Acts. They forcibly closed Boston Harbor, shutting down the economy, and suspended Massachusetts' long-standing right to self-government. The goal was to isolate Massachusetts and terrify the colonies into submission. The strategy backfired. Watching Boston suffer convinced leaders from New Hampshire to Georgia that their liberties were at risk, pushing them toward a unified defense. Representatives from 12 colonies traveled to Philadelphia to form the First Continental Congress. They drafted formal demands for the restoration of their rights, while simultaneously instructing local militias to begin stockpiling weapons and gunpowder. The standoff broke in April 1775.
British troops marching to seize colonial armories at Lexington and Concord were met by armed militia. The ensuing gunfire officially started the American Revolution. With open fighting underway, the Second Continental Congress needed a unified military strategy. They selected a Virginia veteran with a reputation for intense discipline, George Washington, to build and command a continental army. Washington faced the most formidable military machine on Earth. The British Empire fielded tens of thousands of professional soldiers. They were fully funded, uniformly equipped, and backed by a globe-spanning naval fleet. This chart shows the stark contrast in resources. The Continental Army had practically nothing.
Washington was trying to fight a superpower using ordinary farmers and blacksmiths who lacked standard weapons, steady food supplies, and in many cases, basic shoes. Yet early engagements showed unexpected resilience. At the Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775, colonial forces inflicted heavy casualties on advancing British ranks before running out of ammunition. It proved these irregular militias could stand their ground, ensuring a long, exhausting war. The mounting death toll rapidly changed the political math. After engaging in direct, bloody combat with the King's army, the idea of returning to peaceful British rule became impossible for many colonists to envision. In early 1776, Thomas Paine published a short pamphlet called Common Sense. As you can see from its title page, it was addressed directly to the inhabitants of America. Paine argued in plain language that staying under British rule was absurd, giving everyday people the intellectual framework to demand total independence. The pamphlet sold by the thousands, shifting public opinion. By the summer, colonial delegates concluded that reconciliation was a lost cause, and they tasked Thomas Jefferson with formally drafting their separation from the empire. On July 4, 1776, Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. Looking closely at the text, Jefferson argues that unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, precede any government, and people may abolish any power that destroys those rights. This action redefined the war. The soldiers in Washington's camps were no longer fighting for fairer tax policies. They were fighting to create an entirely new republic based on self-government. The ideological clarity of the Declaration met immediate, kinetic resistance. Britain responded by dispatching an armada carrying tens of thousands of heavily armed troops, intent on crushing the rebellion by force. The Continental Army was completely overwhelmed. British forces pushed Washington out of Long Island, captured New York City, and drove the American lines backward in a string of severe defeats. Washington's men were forced to retreat across New Jersey. Plagued by freezing winter conditions, starvation, and mass desertions, the Army's numbers plummeted. Morale had absolute rock bottom. By December 1776, the Revolution was practically dead. The reality of fighting an empire had proven far more complex and lethal than simply signing a document in a Philadelphia statehouse. Washington knew his army's enlistment contracts expired on January 1st. Without a decisive, immediate victory to convince his men to stay, the Continental Army would dissolve into the winter. He authorized an incredibly risky maneuver. On the freezing night of December 25th, Washington loaded 2,400 soldiers into boats, navigating the treacherous, ice-choked Delaware River under the cover of darkness. Before the sun rose, they marched into Trenton and launched a surprise attack on the garrison of Hessian mercenaries. The strike was fast, precise, and entirely overwhelmed the defending forces. News of the victory spread instantly. It provided the exact psychological shock the colonies needed. Desertions halted, new recruits began signing up, and Washington cemented his authority as a commander who could outmaneuver the British. Trenton ensured that the infant republic lived to see 1777. By surviving the winter, the Continental Army prolonged the fight just enough to eventually draw in global powers like France, changing the balance of power in world history. For nearly a century and a half, Britain's 13 colonies in North America expanded steadily. By the mid-18th century, the population stretched from New Hampshire to Georgia, growing to more than 2 million people. The region developed a highly diversified economy. Farmers cultivated the land, local craftsmen built thriving communities, and colonial merchants drove a booming commercial trade across the Atlantic. Politically, the colonists managed their own daily affairs through elected local assemblies. They viewed themselves as loyal subjects of the British Empire, firmly believing they held the exact same rights as citizens living in London. The colonies were virtually self-sustaining and intensely loyal to the crown. A fracture between North America and the British government seemed highly unlikely. In 1763, the 7 Years' War ended. The British victory eliminated the French military threat from North America, but it left the empire with a new set of logistical problems. This map from 1763 shows the massive scale of the new territorial reality. Britain was now responsible for governing and defending an expansive frontier that stretched far beyond the original coastal settlements. Securing this vast territory came at a steep price. This diagram illustrates the resulting crisis. The British government carried a crushing financial debt, while the growing colonial economy operated with very little imperial taxation. Parliament decided on a direct solution to this deficit. They abandoned their long-standing policy of colonial autonomy and introduced new taxes on the Americans to pay for the empire's survival. The British government treated the colonies as a simple revenue stream to solve a mathematical problem, entirely misjudging the political backlash that direct taxation would provoke. Parliament quickly implemented the Sugar Act, followed by the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, aiming to extract wealth from colonial trade. These policies were unavoidable, physical intrusions into daily life. This document displays the official revenue stamps mandated for newspapers and legal documents. Forcing a crown insignia onto local paper goods triggered a deep ideological grievance. Colonists were paying taxes to a parliament located an ocean away, with 0 elected representatives. The colonial response was immediate and organized. Merchants refused to import British goods. Citizens enforced widespread boycotts. angry crowds took to the streets to block tax collectors. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," bridged the gap between wealthy merchants and everyday laborers. What began as a dispute over imperial revenue rapidly became a unified defense of liberty. In 1770, political tension erupted into physical violence. During a street protest in Boston, British soldiers fired into an angry crowd, killing several civilians in an event quickly labeled the Boston Massacre. The civilian deaths hardened colonial resistance. It convinced a growing portion of the public that the British military presence was a lethal, hostile occupation. 3 years later, Parliament attempted to force compliance through the Tea Act, attempting to establish a British corporate monopoly over the colonial tea market. The Sons of Liberty executed a precise, tactical response. On a December night in 1773, men disguised as Native Americans boarded British ships and destroyed over 300 chests of tea in Boston Harbor. Britain retaliated by passing the Intolerable Acts. They effectively shut down Boston Harbor and suspended colonial self-government in Massachusetts, intending to isolate the city and ruin it financially. Attempting to crush a single city guaranteed a continent-wide reaction. By aggressively dismantling local governance, Parliament proved to all 13 colonies that they shared the same existential threat. Delegates from across the continent traveled to Philadelphia to form the First Continental Congress. This network maps a massive political shift. 12 distinct, fiercely independent colonial governments consolidated their political power into one centralized body to challenge the British Empire. The Congress operated with a dual mandate. They demanded the British government restore their constitutional rights, while quietly instructing local towns to arm and train their militias. Diplomacy broke down entirely. The British Crown refused to negotiate with an illegal assembly, and the colonial leaders refused to surrender their political leverage. By establishing a parallel continental government, the colonies had already achieved structural independence. An armed conflict was simply the next mechanical step. In April 1775, the final political ties snapped in the Massachusetts towns of Lexington and Concord. Professional British regulars marched to confiscate colonial weapons, but local militias intercepted them. The ensuing exchange of gunfire ignited an open war. A collection of local farmers, laborers, and merchants now found themselves engaged in direct combat against highly trained imperial soldiers. The time for petitions and boycotts had passed. The American Revolution had begun, putting a disorganized alliance of colonies on a collision course with the most powerful military empire on Earth.